Every satisfying weapon has one flaw. It teaches enemies how to build it. Rome knew this. Britain learned it. America is learning it now. And I finally understand. The dollar is not dying of weakness. It is dying of use. I used to believe sanctions were power. Clean power, surgical power, no bombs dropped, no troops deployed, just financial pressure that forced bad actors into compliance. I never questioned what we were spending to apply that pressure. I never asked what the currency itself was paying for each demonstration of American strength. That blindness was comfortable. Now I see what it cost, and I cannot unsee it. Rome built the first true financial empire. Its coins were more than money. They were messages cut in metal. Every silver denarius that traveled to the edges of the known world carried the face of the emperor. It carried Rome's promise. The promise was simple. Hold this coin. Trade this coin. Your wealth is guaranteed by the greatest military and economic power in history. Traders from Gaul to Persia to the shores of India accepted that promise. For centuries, it held. Then Rome discovered a shortcut. Why tax fairly when you can debase the currency? Why negotiate when you can manipulate? By the time of Emperor Diocletian in 301 AD, the silver content in Roman coins had collapsed to almost nothing. Diocletian responded with the Edict on Maximum Prices. It fixed prices by decree. It criminalized market forces. It was a confession that Rome's monetary weapon had already backfired. When was the last time you questioned whether the dollar would still be the world's currency when you retire? Rome did not fall to barbarians alone. It fell because the world stopped trusting Roman money. Trade routes shifted away from Roman control. Merchants demanded gold instead of imperial coins. Provincial governors hoarded real assets while paying soldiers in worthless metal. The legions that once protected the empire began to extract payment from it. The empire that built its dominance on monetary trust died from monetary betrayal. The barbarians simply walked through the ruins. The real collapse was already complete. Britain repeated the pattern. For over a century, the British pound was the center of global finance. The City of London processed more transactions than any other place on Earth. Every major trade cleared through British banks. Every national treasury held sterling reserves. Britain believed this status was permanent. They believed their currency was exceptional. They believed their empire was different from all that came before. In 1956, Britain and France invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal. The United States opposed the invasion, but America did not send troops to stop it. America did not threaten war. America simply threatened to dump its holdings of British pounds, to sell sterling on the open market, to crash the currency. Britain withdrew from Suez within weeks. The pound never recovered its status. One financial threat ended a century of monetary dominance. If every empire that weaponized its money lost that money, what makes you believe America will be different? I have studied this pattern for years now. Two empires, two reserve currencies, two collapses. The cause was identical each time. They discovered their currency was a weapon. They used the weapon. They used it again. Each use demonstrated power. Each use withdrew trust. They could not see the account balance. They only saw the visible effects. By the time they noticed the damage, the account was empty. America's weapon has a name: the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. You know it as SWIFT. It is the messaging system that moves trillions of dollars between banks every day. Almost every major international transaction passes through SWIFT, and SWIFT can be turned off for any country at any time. America has used this switch repeatedly, increasingly, casually. Today, the United States dollar represents over 60% of global reserves. That sounds dominant, but 2 decades ago, it was over 70%. The slide is slow. The slide is constant. Meanwhile, the number of American sanctions has exploded. In the year 2000, there were roughly 900 active United States sanctions designations. By 2023, that number exceeded 12,000. We are using the weapon faster than ever, and the world is watching. Here is the mechanism that no one in Washington will say aloud. Reserve currency status depends entirely on trust. Specifically, trust in neutrality. Trust that your assets will not be frozen because of a policy disagreement. Trust that the rules will not change overnight. Every sanction, every freeze, every financial weapon demonstrates American power. And every demonstration teaches the same lesson. Your dollars are not your own. They are American leverage. They can be taken. This is the trap. Every demonstration of the weapon advertises the weapon. You cannot use financial power without revealing that you have it. And once revealed, every target begins planning their escape. How many sanctions have been announced in your lifetime that you simply accepted as strength? I used to call this American strength. I used to believe we were enforcing order, maintaining stability, defending democracy with economic tools. Now I understand we were making a different trade. Every time we froze an account, we sold a piece of the dollar's future. Every time we cut off a nation from SWIFT, we funded our own replacement. The weapon worked. And that was exactly the problem. It worked so well that everyone began building defenses. Those defenses are now operational, and the mechanism that built them cannot be reversed. The mechanism is simple once you see it. I wish I had seen it earlier. For years, I watched the dollar as a symbol of strength. I never understood it as a structure. Now, I trace the architecture, and I understand why empires keep repeating the same mistake. The structure itself rewards destruction. It began with Bretton Woods in 1944. 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire to redesign the global financial system. The dollar would become the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would peg to the dollar, and the dollar would peg to gold. The system created order from chaos. It also created something else: dependence. Every nation holding dollar reserves became dependent on American monetary policy. Every trade clearing in dollars strengthened American leverage. For 3 decades, the system worked. America maintained the gold peg. Trust remained intact. Then the trap revealed itself. America had fought an expensive war in Vietnam. It had printed more dollars than it could back with gold. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar would no longer convert to gold at any price. The peg was broken. But something strange happened. The dollar remained the reserve currency anyway. Dependence had become addiction. If you held assets in a foreign country and watched them freeze another nation's reserves overnight, would you leave your money there? In 1974, America secured the addiction permanently. The United States reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would price all oil sales exclusively in dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection. Every nation that needed oil now needed dollars first. The petrodollar system locked the world into dollar dependence for another generation. It was elegant, it was invisible to most observers, and it planted the seed that would eventually destroy everything it built. Here is what I failed to understand for most of my career. Every source of leverage is simultaneously a source of vulnerability. The world needed dollars to buy oil. That meant America could deny dollars to anyone it chose. The weapon was built into the foundation from the beginning. It only required someone willing to use it. The first users were limited. Iran faced sanctions. North Korea faced sanctions. Cuba faced sanctions. These nations were isolated. They lacked alternatives. They could not build countermeasures. The world watched and continued trading in dollars as before. The cost of each sanction was invisible. The benefit was visible and immediate. Politicians faced no consequences for using the weapon. They faced applause instead. So they used it again and again. The structure selected for overuse. It could not select for anything else. I remember watching the sanctions mount over the years. Each announcement felt like strength. Each target seemed to deserve it. I never calculated the cumulative message being broadcast to every nation watching. That message was not about the targets. It was about the weapon itself, and every nation was taking notes. How many times have you heard sanctions announced and assumed it was someone else's problem? By 2023, the United States had imposed over 12,000 active sanctions designations. That number had grown from roughly 900 in the year 2000, 12 times more in 2 decades. The weapon that once targeted rogue states now touched supply chains across the globe. Secondary sanctions threatened any nation trading with sanctioned entities. The message spread further with each use. Your dollars can be taken. Your transactions can be blocked. Your assets can be frozen without warning or trial. Then came February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The Western response was unprecedented in scale. Approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves were frozen overnight. Not oligarch accounts, not individual assets, a nation's savings. The accumulated reserves from decades of selling oil and gas to Europe. Frozen in a single weekend, inaccessible, possibly never to be returned. I remember reading the headlines that week. I remember feeling the freeze was justified. I did not consider what every finance minister in every non-aligned nation was thinking at that exact moment. But now I know what they concluded. They concluded one sentence. If they can do this to Russia, they can do this to us. The mechanism works through a structural contradiction. Every sanction sends 2 signals simultaneously. Signal 1 says, we are powerful enough to freeze your assets. Signal 2 says your assets are not safe with us. The first signal is temporary. It fades when the crisis passes. The second signal is permanent. It cannot be withdrawn by any policy, and it creates irreversible action in response. Within months of the Russian freeze, central banks began buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. China accelerated development of its own payment systems. India began settling oil trades in rupees instead of dollars. Saudi Arabia itself started discussing yuan-denominated oil sales with Beijing. The freeze was a demonstration of power. Like every demonstration before it, that power funded the construction of escape routes. What percentage of your retirement is denominated in a currency being actively weaponized against dozens of nations? This is the trap no policy can escape. The short-term benefits of sanctions are visible. Headlines celebrate them. Voters approve of them. Politicians benefit from them. The long-term costs are invisible. They accumulate in decisions made by foreign finance ministers. They compound in bilateral trade agreements signed without announcement. By the time the costs become visible, the politicians who caused them are out of office. The asymmetry is structural. It cannot be reformed by any election. It can only play out to its conclusion. I used to believe sanctions were a choice, a tool to deploy or withhold based on rational strategy. Now I understand they function as an addiction. The system creates constant pressure to use them. Every international crisis demands visible response. Every response requires action that can be reported. Sanctions are always available. They cost nothing in the short term. They are always applauded by domestic audiences. The structure does not permit restraint. It rewards escalation. It punishes patience. It guarantees that any empire holding a financial weapon will use that weapon until it breaks. The question is not whether America will stop using the weapon. The structure prevents stopping. No president can run on a platform of fewer sanctions. No Congress will vote to reduce leverage. The question is only how long before the accumulated damage becomes undeniable. Rome needed 2 centuries to destroy its monetary credibility. Britain needed 40 years. America's clock started in 1974. It accelerated after 2001. It entered terminal velocity in 2022. And the timeline is compressing in ways that I never expected to witness in my lifetime. The timeline is compressing faster than any model predicted. I built my career on historical patterns. I assumed those patterns would unfold at historical speeds. I was wrong. Rome's monetary collapse took nearly 2 centuries. Britain's reserve currency decline took roughly 40 years. America's erosion is measured in single years now, and I am watching it accelerate in real time. The difference is information velocity. When Rome debased its currency, word traveled by horseback. Provincial governors might not learn of monetary manipulation for months. By the time traders adjusted, years had passed. The empire had time to adapt. It had time to attempt reforms. It squandered that time, but the time existed. Britain had less time. Telegraph and radio spread financial news in days. Markets adjusted in weeks. The Suez Crisis in 1956 collapsed confidence within a single month. But even that speed allowed for some adjustment. Today, news travels at the speed of light. The Russian reserve freeze was announced on a Friday. By Monday, finance ministers across Asia, Africa, and South America were meeting. By the following month, alternative payment systems were being accelerated. By year-end, central banks had purchased over 1,000 tons of gold, the fastest accumulation in decades. The message had been received. The response had already begun. Have you noticed that more nations are announcing trade agreements in currencies other than dollars? I track these agreements now. I did not track them 3 years ago. I assumed they were marginal, symbolic gestures by nations too small to matter. That assumption was wrong. In 2023, China and Brazil signed an agreement to settle trade in their own currencies. Argentina followed, then Bangladesh, then Pakistan. Each agreement is small in isolation. Together, they form a pattern. The pattern is acceleration. The pattern is escape. The first major de-dollarization push began in 2014. Russia faced sanctions after the annexation of Crimea. Those sanctions were limited compared to what came later, but they delivered a clear message to Moscow. Your reserves are at risk. Your access to SWIFT is conditional. Your financial system exists at American discretion. Russia began building alternatives immediately. They created SPFS, their own financial messaging system. They stockpiled gold. They negotiated bilateral trade deals in rubles and yuan. I dismissed these efforts at the time. Most analysts did. We assumed Russia was too isolated to build viable alternatives. We assumed their systems would remain marginal forever. We assumed the dollar's network effects were unbreakable. Then 2022 arrived. The freeze was implemented. And we discovered that Russia had spent 8 years preparing for exactly that moment. Their alternatives were operational, not perfect, but functional. And suddenly, every nation watching had a template to follow. The BRICS expansion in 2023 was the moment I understood the acceleration was real. The original BRICS nations were Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Skeptics had dismissed them for years. Too diverse, too conflicted. No shared interests beyond rhetoric. Then 6 new nations were invited to join: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia. Argentina later paused its entry, but the invitation itself sent shockwaves through currency markets. When you hear BRICS dismissed as irrelevant, do you consider who benefits from your dismissal? Saudi Arabia's inclusion was the fact I could not ignore. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia was the linchpin of dollar dominance. The petrodollar agreement of 1974 guaranteed that oil would be priced in dollars. That single arrangement forced every oil-importing nation to hold dollar reserves. It created artificial demand for American currency, regardless of American policy. And now the Saudis were sitting at a table designed to discuss alternatives. China and Russia now conduct the majority of their bilateral trade in local currencies, not in dollars. The yuan and the ruble move directly between their economies without American intermediation. This seemed impossible a decade ago. The infrastructure did not exist. The trust did not exist. The volume was negligible. Today, the infrastructure is operational. The trust was forged by shared opposition to American financial weaponry. The volume is measured in hundreds of billions annually. Here is the mechanism that accelerates everything. De-dollarization does not require a single replacement currency. The dollar did not replace the pound by being chosen at a conference. It replaced the pound through 1,000 individual decisions, through bilateral agreements, through trade settlements, through reserve diversification. The process was gradual and then sudden. The same pattern is unfolding now, but faster, because every nation can see the template. Every nation can copy the playbook. The threshold is not replacement. The threshold is fragmentation. The dollar does not need to be abandoned completely. It only needs to lose enough market share that alternatives become self-sustaining. Once that threshold is crossed, network effects reverse. Instead of everyone using dollars because everyone else uses dollars, nations begin abandoning dollars because alternatives have achieved critical mass. That reversal point is approaching. How much of your financial planning assumes the dollar will retain its current purchasing power for the next 20 years? Central bank gold purchases tell the story in metal. In 2022, central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold. They repeated that pace in 2023. These are the highest levels of official gold accumulation in generations. Gold offers no yield. It pays no interest. It generates no income. Central banks are not buying gold for returns. They are buying gold because it cannot be frozen. It cannot be sanctioned. It exists outside the American financial system. Every ton of gold purchased is a vote against dollar confidence. I spent years believing the dollar's dominance was permanent. I believed the network effects were too strong. I believed the alternatives were too weak. I believed that even if de-dollarization began, it would take decades to matter. I was measuring by historical speeds. I forgot that we no longer live in historical time. We live in digital time. Information spreads instantly. Decisions compound immediately. Alternatives scale exponentially. The consequence phase is no longer theoretical. It is not a matter of decades. The bilateral agreements are signed. The payment systems are operational. The gold is accumulating in vaults that American sanctions cannot reach. Every week brings another announcement. Another trade deal settled in yuan. Another nation joining an alternative payment network. Another central bank reducing its treasury holdings. The timeline that took Rome 2 centuries and Britain 40 years is collapsing into a single decade for America. And we are already years into that decade. The question everyone asks is whether this can be reversed, whether policy can restore what policy destroyed, whether trust can be rebuilt through reform. I spent months searching for a mechanism that could achieve this. I found none. The threshold has already been crossed, and I can now identify the exact moment it happened. The irreversibility threshold is not when the dollar loses majority share of global reserves. It is not when another currency replaces it. The threshold is earlier and harder to see. It is the moment when alternatives become functional, when backup systems go operational, when the cost of maintaining those systems falls below the risk of remaining dependent. That moment arrived between 2022 and 2024. The Russian reserve freeze was the trigger, approximately $300 billion removed from Moscow's control without warning. Every finance minister watching understood the implication immediately. Reserves held in dollars are not reserves. They are hostages, and hostages can be taken at any moment for any reason that Washington deems sufficient. This was not a theoretical risk anymore. It was demonstrated reality. If the dollar loses reserve status in the next decade, what happens to the retirement you planned in dollars? Here is why reversal is impossible. To restore trust, America would need to demonstrate that frozen reserves would be returned, that sanctioned nations would be reconnected to SWIFT, that financial weaponization would end permanently. But doing so would reward the behavior that triggered the sanctions. It would signal weakness to domestic audiences. It would create political suicide for any administration attempting it. The structure prevents the very actions that could slow the damage. Even if a future administration attempted reversal, the damage is already locked in. China has built CIPS, its cross-border interbank payment system. Russia has SPFS. India is expanding its rupee settlement mechanisms. These systems were expensive to build. They required years of development. But now they exist. They function. And no American policy can unmake them. The alternatives are permanent infrastructure now. I understand now why no empire stopped in time. The benefits of weaponization are visible and immediate. A sanction is announced. Headlines celebrate strength. Voters approve. Politicians gain approval ratings. The costs are invisible and delayed. They accumulate in foreign capitals. They manifest in decisions made quietly. By the time the costs become visible enough to matter politically, the damage is irreversible. And the politicians who caused it are no longer in office. This answers the question that haunted me for years. Why does America keep using the weapon, because the structure offers no alternative. Every international crisis creates domestic pressure for visible action. Sanctions are always available. They cost nothing in budgetary terms. They deliver immediate political benefits. The long-term structural costs are borne by future administrations and future populations. The incentive structure guarantees overuse. It cannot produce any other outcome. Britain faced the same trap. After World War II, Britain was financially exhausted. It needed American loans to survive, but it still possessed the world's reserve currency. British policymakers believed the pound's status was permanent. They used that status as leverage. They manipulated currency controls, they pressured trading partners, and they never noticed the account balance falling. When America threatened to dump sterling during the Suez Crisis in 1956, Britain had no choice but to comply. The pound collapsed. But the collapse was not caused by that single threat. It was caused by 2 decades of treating structural privilege as permanent power. When the history of this period is written, will you be among those who understood what was happening, or those who were told it was impossible? The consequence for Americans is not abstract. It is not geopolitical theory. It is purchasing power. The dollar's reserve status creates artificial demand for American currency. Foreign central banks must hold dollars to participate in global trade. That demand allows America to run massive deficits without immediate inflation. It allows the Federal Reserve to print currency that other nations absorb. The moment that demand falls, those dynamics reverse. The dollars held overseas begin returning home, and the purchasing power collapses. Over $7 trillion in United States Treasury debt is currently held by foreign entities. Those entities are not holding treasuries out of charity. They are holding them because dollar reserves are necessary for trade. When yuan, rupees, and gold become viable alternatives, the necessity disappears. Foreign central banks will not announce a mass sell-off. They will simply stop rolling over maturing bonds. They will diversify slowly and quietly. By the time the trend becomes obvious, it will be too late to counteract. The Federal Reserve now faces an impossible dual mandate. It must defend the dollar's international value to prevent foreign selling. Simultaneously, it must support domestic economic conditions through low interest rates. These objectives are contradictory. Raising rates to defend the dollar crashes the domestic economy. Lowering rates to support growth accelerates foreign diversification. There is no policy path that solves both problems. The choice is which crisis to accept first. I calculated my own exposure last year. Every retirement account I hold is denominated in dollars. Every bond, every treasury holding, every money market fund. The assumption embedded in those holdings is that the dollar will retain approximate purchasing power for the next 20 to 30 years. I never questioned that assumption before. Now I see it for what it is: a bet that America will be the first empire in history to weaponize its currency without consequence. The historical record offers no support for that bet. What would you do differently if you accepted that this process cannot be reversed? The purchasing power decline is already measurable. The dollar has lost over 30% of its purchasing power over the past 2 decades by some measures. That decline occurred while the dollar still held reserve status. When reserve status ends, the decline accelerates. Import prices rise. Energy costs increase. Every product with international inputs becomes more expensive. The standard of living sustained by reserve currency privilege begins to compress, and there is no policy mechanism to prevent it. This is not prophecy. This is pattern recognition. Rome collapsed when its currency lost credibility. Britain declined when the pound lost reserve status. The mechanism is identical each time. A currency becomes dominant through trust. That dominance is weaponized. The weaponization destroys trust. Alternatives emerge. The former reserve currency does not disappear. It simply becomes one option among many, and the empire that issued it loses the privilege of printing wealth that others must accept. The cognitive lock is this: you cannot unsanction, you cannot unfreeze, you cannot restore trust through any policy mechanism once the trust is broken. The process is thermodynamic. It moves in one direction. Every sanction announcement is irreversible, not because the sanctions cannot be lifted, but because the demonstration of power cannot be undemonstrated. The world has seen the weapon. The world is building defenses. Those defenses are now operational, and no American election changes that fact. I believed for most of my career that financial collapse was a choice, that with correct policy, stability could be maintained indefinitely. I no longer believe that. The structure itself contains the contradiction. Reserve currency status depends on neutrality, but empires cannot remain neutral. They must act. They must respond to crises. They must demonstrate power. And every demonstration spends the currency's credibility. The trap was built into the system from the beginning. We are simply watching it close. The dollar is not collapsing because America is weak. It is collapsing because America used its strength. Every sanction was a demonstration of power. Every demonstration was a withdrawal from trust. The account is nearly empty, and there is no mechanism to refill it. Rome thought its coins would last forever. Britain assumed the pound was permanent. We were taught the dollar was different. It is not different. It is next. And now I see. You cannot weaponize trust. You can only spend it.